Hey guys, and welcome back to another episode of this How to Get Jacked series. This is episode number 2, and we're going to be talking about form and technique. In the last one, we spoke about exercise selection. So if you haven't watched that video, definitely suggest going back to watch it, as it kind of flows on into obviously how to, once we've chosen that exercise, actually how to perform it. Okay. Now let's get into the video. So form and technique. Is there such thing as a perfect form or technique? Now, there's not a hell of a lot of research when it comes to actually perfecting form and sort of what's optimal for muscle growth. There's a little bit obviously around range of motion, which you spoke about getting into that lengthened position. And there's a little bit around tempo as well, but there's definitely nothing to like sort of further on past that. And a couple of things that we're going to talk about today is a little bit more speculation, anecdote, what sort of the like standard around the industry when it comes to people that are trying to maximize muscle growth. So first question that we need to ask is the goal primarily muscle growth? Now, if you are looking to improve, say, your 1RM on the barbell bench press, this episode might not be for you. In this episode, we're purely focusing on maximizing muscle growth. Also, you'll get stronger regardless if you're growing muscle, because you're just going to have more muscle to be able to push or pull whatever the weight is you're trying to, so you will obviously get stronger. But if your specific goal is to get stronger to 1RM, as I said, it's probably maybe not the episode for you. Now, range of motion. Obviously, we spoke a little bit in the last one about the lengthened position and how important that is, and all the research that's coming out suggests that exposing the muscle to tension in the lengthened position is probably going to be the most hypertrophic position and going to promote the most muscle growth. Okay, so we definitely don't want to be missing out on the lengthened position in the movement. So if we're into bench press, as I said, we don't want to be stopping off the chest. If we're using a barbell, we're coming down all the way to the chest. Even better, if we're using dumbbells, you want to come down as far as we can to really expose the chest to that lengthened position and a lot of tension at that lengthened position. Tempo. Now, there has been a couple of studies done on tempo, which sort of show that anything from 1 to sort of 8 seconds to complete a rep doesn't really seem too much different. Now, I would take that from sort of personal experience and sort of anecdote. You probably go from like 2 to maybe 6 seconds. I feel like anything over a 4-second eccentric is probably going to be a bit overkill. Now, eccentric means on the way down, so anything over 4, 3, 2, 1 is probably going to be a little bit of an overkill. I generally wouldn't do more than 2 or 3, depending on the movement as well. So something like, say, a squat, you might want to do a little bit slower, purely because you have so much further to get down. So that's just going to play into it a little bit as well. So say if you were doing calf raises, for example, doing a 4-second eccentric on a calf raise because you're only moving 10 centimeters is like, that's very, very slow. Whereas if you were to look at, say, a barbell back squat, where you might have to actually move the bar, depending on how tall you are, from like 50 centimeters to a meter, depending on how tall you are, obviously the speed at which the bar is moving greatly changes from, say, a 10 centimeter movement, which you would see in a calf raise. So there's a couple of little caveats there. So something like a calf raise, perfectly fine to do 1-2 second eccentric as long as you got that control on the way down. Whereas something like maybe a barbell back squat or any type of squat variation, you might be looking at around 2 to 4 seconds. So I hope that sort of clears up the tempo side of things. On the way up, okay, we want to just be doing it forcefully. Now, generally, you are in control on the upward phase just purely because the weight's going to be pushing against you or pulling against you. So generally, that concentric, whether it's a pull, whether it's a push, is generally always going to be controlled due to the weight. Okay, so just remember that any downward phase or eccentric is going to have to be controlled a little bit slower. Really try and focus on using the muscles or stretching the muscles that you're trying to target. And then when we go into our concentric, whether it be pull, whether it be push, nice and explosive, and the control generally takes care of itself because of the weight. Okay. Now, pauses. In the shortened position. So say if we were doing a bench press and pausing at the top, you would have to argue seems counterproductive, just purely because of all the research coming out about the lengthened position. So if anything, you probably want to do maybe a pause in the lengthened position. So it being a more growth promoting position as opposed to the shortened kind of seems a little bit counterintuitive or counterproductive. But by all means, if it feels good for you, then definitely do it. I would just suggest that if you're going to pause at any point in the movement, it will probably be in that stretch position. So hopefully that helps. And then just body positioning. So depending on what movement you're doing, you just want to make sure that the exercise lines up with the muscle that you're trying to target. Now, a common one that I think of when thinking about body positioning is back training. Because depending on where you're pulling, so the positioning of your elbow, if you keep your elbow close to your side, you're going to be hitting more lat, whether that's coming from a vertical or coming from a horizontal. You're generally going to be hitting more lat, whereas you have your elbow more out to the side, you're generally going to be hitting a little bit more upper back. Okay, so little nuances around that, little shifts, little changes will obviously target different areas of the back. Just purely because there's so many muscle groups in the back that you want to pay a little bit more attention to where you're placing your elbow or your body positioning or how you stretch the back to try and get the most out of it. But when it comes to everything else, like chest, you can kind of put your elbows generally where you want. It's going to target similar sort of muscle groups. Yeah, you've got different fibers that come across the chest, but mostly you're going to hit pretty much everything, especially if you're taking it pretty close to failure and your elbows aren't in a completely ridiculous place. You'll generally be fine. You know what I mean? The main thing when it comes to anything sort of outside of back training, I'll just go what feels like it places more tension and more stretch on the muscle, and what doesn't hurt the joints. That would be the two main things that I would focus on outside of back training, because as I said, back training can become a little bit more complicated because there is a lot of muscle groups at the back there. And if you're trying to target one specific muscle, you might want to pay a little bit more attention to where positioning the body so that you're actually hitting that muscle group and you're not incorporating another muscle group that you don't really want to. So yeah, outside of that, you're pretty much golden outside of back training. Then why should we worry about adequate form? Okay, so why is it so important? Now, there's a couple of reasons why we should be focusing on it. As I said, it's not super supported by the research, but if you just sort of think anecdote, your experiences, other professionals in the industry that I've listened to, this is kind of their experiences as well. Obviously, we want to drive tension to the target muscle. So by slowing down eccentrics, by having our arm positioning, all of those things is going to allow us to target the muscle group and get a little bit of that mind-muscle connection that people talk about. I don't think it's super important. I think it's kind of overkill sometimes, but you still want to feel like the muscle that you're trying to target is working. So sometimes slowing down a downward phase to really try and feel that, or it's a bit of a squeeze at the top, can only be beneficial if you feel like you're targeting, you actually feel it. It makes a big difference. It also makes it more enjoyable. You know what I mean? If you feel like that you're actually targeting, you feel like you're getting something out of it, you're more inclined to want to continue to get better at that exercise and to progress yourself. And then just to increase the stimulus to fatigue ratio. So I don't think I've really talked about this yet on the channel too much. The stimulus to fatigue ratio just pretty much means how much stimulus we're getting as opposed to how much fatigue. Now, generally we look at fatigue as like a joint soreness, discomfort of the movement. So if we were to think about something like, say, like a barbell back squat, you want to sort of compare how much you feel tension, you feel like the pump, how like when you finish the work, the set, how pumped up do your quads feel when you're in it? Do you feel a massive stretch? Do you feel a lot of tension? Is the burn coming from the quads? If you're feeling all those things, then it's probably a good tick, especially if you aren't getting, say, any knee pain or any lower back pain. anything around sort of joint soreness and discomfort, if you're trying to minimize that joint soreness and discomfort, but also try and increase the tension, increase the burn, increase the pump that you're getting from, say, the barbell back squat that you're doing, then you would say that it is a good stimulus to fatigue ratio for that barbell back squat. So you're getting a lot of stimulus with very little fatigue. Whereas if you do, say, maybe a leg press variation that you haven't done before, and you feel a lot of joint soreness, like in your knees feel all jacked up, your lower back starting to jack up, and you don't really feel much tension, much pump in your quads, then you'd probably say that the stimulus fatigue ratio on that isn't very good, because you've got a lot of fatigue through joint soreness, discomfort, and you've got little stimulus through tension, through pump, through the feel of the stretch, feel of the burn. So you've got minimal stimulus, but a lot of fatigue. So you'd probably say that exercise isn't very good, or maybe you need to change your body positioning. Maybe you change your feet, where you're putting your feet, where you're putting your knees. Maybe you can chuck a pad underneath your back to try and alleviate a little bit of back pain. A few things that we can change in the technique might increase that stimulus to fatigue ratio. And then from there, you've got standardizing long-term progression. Now, this is a really big one, and I think it gets overlooked why technique and form is so important. Now, if you're to look at muscle growth, generally muscle growth is going to be tied in with how much stronger you are getting, especially for reps. Okay, so it's not so much tied into 1 RMs. So if your bench press 1 RM got stronger over time, doesn't necessarily mean that you're growing muscle. But if your bench press 10 RM, so how much weight you can move for 10 reps increases, it's a very good correlation to that, the fact that you're actually growing muscle. So that's sort of what I look at as proxies for muscle growth. So when I'm in a build phase, I'm looking at, is my body weight increasing slowly over time? And is my performance in the gym also increasing over time? But to do this, I need to make sure that my reps are standardized. Okay, so again, if we're looking at something like a barbell back squat, or a really good example actually is a Smith machine back squat. So on the Smith machine, you can put those little clips on the side where you can come down and touch the clips. So that's the bottom of the movement. And then obviously you drive all the way up till you're fully locked out. So that's a way of standardizing that technique. So if I can do, say I start the build phase and I'm lifting 60 kilos for 10 reps. And then by the end of it, I'm lifting 80 kilos for 10 reps. You'd have to say, and I'm still getting that full range of motion, so I'm hitting the bottom position there and I'm driving all the way up. You'd have to say I had to have grown some sort of muscle to be able to move 20 extra kilos for 10 reps. You'd have to say that I've grown some sort of muscle in that. So that's why I think standardizing technique is so important, because if you were to go into this Smith machine and not put the safeties there where you'd be hitting it on the way down, and you're just sort of guesstimating, you might actually find that your range of motion is shortening over the time. So you might actually not going as low, which is how you are able to increase that weight, because you're just shortening your range of motion. So potentially you're not even really putting on muscle, you're just changing your range of motion to be able to lift more weight, if that sort of makes sense. So I really think it's important for standardizing long-term progression to really guarantee that you're actually putting on muscle over time. Decreased risk of injury and staleness. So pretty much alluded to this in the stimulus to fatigue ratio. If you have a lot of fatigue and very little stimulus, the chance of injury is probably going to go up. If you have constant knee pain, you're pretty much already there anyway. You've already got a niggle injury, plus the staleness is going to go up. So if you don't feel that stimulus in your quads and you just feel a lot of joint pain, the likelihood of you wanting to continue that exercise is very, very low. So by implementing different techniques to try and perfect your form and your technique around a certain movement to try and improve your stimulus to fatigue ratio, it's going to enable you to be able to train that exercise for longer and to progress in that exercise for longer, which will eventually decrease your risk of injury, only very slightly, but will massively decrease your chance of staleness for that particular exercise. And then just applying tension to the target muscle in the lengthened position. So we've spoken a little bit about this in obviously the range of motion. We just want to make sure that the technique and form that we're using allows us to expose the muscle to a full range of motion. So if we're looking at something like a barbell back squat, are we getting as deep as we can? Are we sacrificing range of motion to lift more weight? Can we potentially put something under our heels so that we're able to come into more knee flexion and get into a deeper squat to expose the quads into a more stretch position, which we know is growth promoting? All of these things need to be taken into account to try and perfect technique to expose the muscle to more stimulus, to more tension, and all of these things, and also trying to reduce fatigue and risk of injury. So all these things obviously going to be super important when it comes to trying to look at long-term growth. I think in the short term, form and technique doesn't really seem all that important, but if you stack it up over the course of a year, and it means you can stay at an exercise for longer because staleness doesn't come about, injury is less prevalent, all these things, range of motion. So each time you go into that little bit more of a deeper position, you're going to get a little bit more opportunity to grow muscle because it's more growth promoting. So all of these things start to stack up if you're looking at it over a long-term time period. So hope this has helped, guys. Hope this has been informative. I went off on a few tangents there. Obviously you can see I'm kind of a bit passionate about this stuff. Love talking about it. So hopefully we'll see you in the next episode. Do all the good things, like, subscribe, share, all of those things that you do on YouTube, and I'll see you for the next one. Cheers, guys.